Hey friends, it's Warren and Mary from Exploretography, bringing you another video in the Photography A to Z series.
And in this series, we take photo terminology, we break it down for you in hopes to give you a better understanding of each term. So today's word of the day is aperture. So aperture is essentially the opening in the lens that allows light to move through the lens to the sensor or film. It is one of the three fundamentals of photography when we talk about the exposure triangle. So you have aperture, ISO, and shutter speed. One of the things that aperture determines is the depth of field in an image, and then another important factor that it determines is the brightness of the image.
Yep. And aperture is also referred to, when we say aperture, it's a diaphragm that's actually in the lens, and that diaphragm is adjustable, allowing how much light goes through that lens and hitting the sensor. So that diaphragm is made up of leaves, and typically 9 leaves that create a circle, which is called your aperture opening, and is measured in f-stops that we'll get to in another video. But the one thing that your camera is determining its aperture range is based on what lens you select to put on your camera. And on that camera, it'll tell you a minimum and maximum aperture for that specific lens.
So one way to look at it is like your pupils in your eyes. So when you go into a dark room, that pupil gets really big and allows more light to come through so you can see the scene. On the opposite end, when you are in bright daylight, your pupils will get really small to adjust for that and to limit the amount of light coming through to your eyes. So that might be a good comparison if you're having a difficult time understanding. But what we want to really get into is how, when you modify your aperture, how it changes or what the result is in your image. So if you increase the f-stop number, so as Warren mentioned, aperture is measured in f-stops. You might see f5.6, f22. The higher the number, the smaller the opening in the lens is, restricting the light that's coming through. And again, this results in less light to the sensor, but it also results in a great depth of field. So what you'll see is there's gonna be more sharpness from the front to the back of your image. So very useful in landscape photography when you really want everything to be as sharp as possible. And then another result that it has by making that hole smaller is reduced brightness in the image. So if you're looking at an image that's overly bright and you're looking for a way to decrease that brightness, one way to do that would be by increasing that f-stop number and making that opening smaller. By making that opening smaller though, again, we're saying we're gonna need less light will be coming through the lens. Sometimes you're gonna need to reduce your shutter speed to allow more time for the camera to capture that exposure because there is less light coming in.
Cool. Let's take a look at decreasing your f-stop or increasing the size of your aperture. This will allow more light to pass through the lens and hit the sensor. It'll also impact your depth of field. It'll give you less depth of field. So things will be not as sharp from your subject, your focal point back, or in front as well. So when you use this less depth of field is used a lot in portraiture. We use a very small f-stop, a large aperture, which gives us a creamy background when we focus, and it actually creates a separation from the subject and the background. So it takes a very noisy background and isolates your subject and causes a blur on the background that lets the viewer focus directly on the subject you're trying to represent in the image. So as we increase the size of the opening in the aperture, we're decreasing the f-stop, but what we're also doing is increasing brightness. So if we have a darker image and we're set under those three fundamentals of the triangle, the aperture, the shutter speed, and the ISO, if we increase the size of the opening by decreasing the f-stop and the aperture, we'll actually allow more light and the image will be brighter. But to maintain that same exposure, if we increase the aperture, say we want to do a minimum aperture of like 2.8, and we would need to realize that we have to make adjustments accordingly to ISO and shutter speed to offset that more light passing through the lens and making the same exposure or a good exposure that you were shooting for.
Yeah, so to quickly summarize, as we mentioned, depth of field is one thing that's going to be affected by aperture. So a quick example is Warren and I are on the same plane in an image. If you have a low aperture, let's say 2.8, and you focus on us, this plane is going to be in focus. Anything in front and back will be blurry, as Warren mentioned. Now, as you increase that number, the plane in focus is gonna become wider. So more in front is gonna become in focus, and more in back as well. So just if you keep that in mind, it works kind of on a plane. And another thing to remember is for each adjustment you make in your aperture, up or down, to maintain that exposure that you're going for, you're going to need to adjust the shutter speed or ISO in the opposite direction, but in an equal amount.
Yeah. So understanding aperture is pretty fundamental on your photography journey. To understanding how photography works, being a film camera or a digital camera, they're all based on that triangle, and aperture being one of the points, one of those fundamental points to that triangle. Getting a better grasp of that and understanding the relationship between f-stop, the size of the opening, the bokeh or soft background, the depth of field, that's all controlled by the aperture, and it's a great thing to learn.
Yeah, it's a very tricky concept in the beginning of photography. I know some people struggle with the concept, but don't give up. You'll get it. We promise you. Just keep working on it, keep reading about it, keep practicing, and you'll see how the aperture does affect your photos.
Yeah, and keep at it. So if you found any of the information in this video valuable, which we hope you did, please share it with your peers, your friends. Let other people know that are struggling with aperture. We're here to help you out, or introduce them to our Photography A to Z series. We hope this terminology, the understanding of the terminology, will help you on your photography journey.
Again, if you like this video, please like it. Please comment below if there's something that you really liked about it or something that we can do better. We're always open to bettering ourselves. And if you haven't already, please subscribe to be notified when we put out new videos.
Yeah, and if you're in your photography journey and looking for a group of like-minded people, we host a Facebook group called Exploretography, a community for active photographers. And we have a good group there that talks about photography, do weekly challenges at different topics. We get out there and share our images, answer questions. It's a great group. So please, we'd love to have you join us. So come on out to Facebook and join our group and join the conversation.
And until then, explore,
create,
and do good. Bye.